morning and welcome to today's discussion. This is a continuation of the discussion that we had yesterday. Yesterday we were discussing climate change and energy transition and what they actually are. And we had a very lively session in terms of the discussion. So what is going to happen today, we are going to switch it up a bit and now discuss the question of energy transition and the future of oil, coal, and gas extraction. This is an important topic because, we have a lot of discoveries happening around the African continent at a time when everyone is saying we should transition out of these resources. So what kind of transition are we going to see if we are talking about these resources being taken off the market and being left on the ground, for example? What is the reality on the African continent and how can we talk about justice in the energy transition space? So to begin us off, I'll invite Ms. Pavin Ngala, who is the head of Oxfam, Horn and Eastern African region, to be able to give the opening remarks and then we'll proceed from there. Welcome, Pavin.
Thanks a lot, Edgar, and thanks to everyone who has joined the meeting today. It's really great to have this very critical conversation in addition to deliberating really as we prepare for COP27. So I, really just on this webinar series around positioning the Africa's civil society and citizens on climate change, energy transition, extractives and readiness for COP27. One of the things I'm sure we all appreciate is that the effects of climate change are undeniable. We are already seeing them in the various crises across the continent, whether it's the cyclones in Southern Africa, the hunger crisis that's very much continental. In East Africa, for example, we're talking about 44 million people who are facing food insecurity because of drought, because of floods. In 2019 and 2020, we in fact had locust infestations that destroyed millions of acres of food crops. This, we must say, is already in an environment where we're talking about the impact of conflict in the region. COVID-19 has only served to really exacerbate the resource gaps and ability of the governments to respond to citizen needs. So as we reflect, today, as we start this meeting, this webinar, the day 2 of this webinar series, we recognize that the extractives industry has been noted as one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. At the moment, in terms of energy use industry, it contributes 83% of global gas emissions. We've talked about the world moving towards decarbonization by 2050, but a spotlight has been put really on reducing fossil fuel use, such as coal, oil, and gas. Coincidentally, for us on the continent, these discussions are happening at a time when very many countries in Eastern Africa, as an example, are gearing up, towards commercial production of their newfound oil and gas resources. In Uganda, for example, a final investment decision for the exploitation of crude oil deposits in the Albertine region was made. We know that there are plans in Kenya, to exploit their oil deposits in Turkana region, and they're advancing really by the day. Meanwhile, in Tanzania, they've already commenced commercial production of their natural gas in Songo Songo in 2004 and Mnazi Bay in 2006. We know that these aspirations are confounded in terms of what they are hoping to do. We are hoping, our governments are hoping that they will play a catalytic role in the economic growth at a time when there's really need to bolster recovery from the shocks of COVID-19. With the limited options that we do have, in terms of domestic resource mobilization, the escalating public debt and evidently rising inequality, many developing countries are looking, to their fossil fuel projects to generate the much needed foreign exchange to finance service delivery. At the moment, if we look at the research that is available, it's estimated that $136 billion will be needed to cover investments in renewable energy projects in Africa. While on the other hand, one of the things we also know is that approximately $88 billion, 3.6% of our gross domestic product on the continent annually is lost in illicit financial flows. So it puts to us the question, will we really, as developing countries, be able to raise the finances needed for a just energy transition? We know, on the other hand, and I was listening to some of the discussions yesterday, that 600 million people on the continent do not have access to electricity. What does that mean? On the other hand, 900 million people, again on the continent, lack access to clean energy cooking facilities. How do we address that gap? Many countries are in a trilemma between meeting their climate change commitments, addressing glaring energy poverty, and commercializing their fossil fuel projects to raise domestic revenues to jumpstart their economies. I have to say, and because we're hearing this every day in the news recently, that the current crisis in Ukraine is likely to affect the dynamics globally on this conversation, because we're already seeing the gaps in terms of the increased prices of fuel. I know, for example, that in Kenya, there's been queues and queues of people trying to get fuel. There's also what we are calling another scramble for alternative fuel supply, outside of Ukraine and Russia, which presents another dilemma. And we all know that Africa will get caught up in it. So reflecting back on yesterday's discussions, that also what we'd like to discuss today, yesterday's discussion was able to highlight critical issues, whether it is around technology transfer to leapfrog our renewable energy actions, investment in research as we really, increase our understanding of the options. I'm hoping that today's, discussions, and I'm really looking forward to those deliberations on provoking our thinking about the options, really, realistic options for us as a continent, the future of oil, coal, and gas. And we hope that from these discussions that plausible policy options will be generated, especially for developing countries on the African continent, and on how we manage our resources while averting the catastrophic effects of climate change. So colleagues, I put it to you. We always say that we want homegrown solutions, African solutions, and we have an opportunity to input with the COP27 happening on the continent to very much, recognize that while the generation of the climate change impacts has been outside the continent, or at least a significant portion of it, that the impact of it is significantly felt by those on the continent. So we do need to come together around what the solutions could be. So back to you, Edgar, and I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much for those opening remarks. I think what I've been able to pick there is the trilemma. How do we address the trilemma of, dealing with climate change, addressing biting poverty, and trying to commercialize what we already see as fossil fuels? How do we address that situation? So I'll shift gears a bit and now introduce the main speaker. I'm introducing next to be able to share his presentation is David Manley. David Manley is a senior economic analyst at Natural Resources Governance Institute. David focuses on resource-rich countries and the energy transition. He has provided technical assistance on tax policy in countries ranging from Myanmar, Kyrgyzstan, Ghana, Tanzania, and Uganda. Prior to joining NRGI, David was an Overseas Development Institute Fellow and Senior Economist in the Zambia Revenue Authority, focusing on mining, tax policy, and administration. He also worked for Oxford Economic Research Associates on financial regulation and utility finance in the UK and EU. David holds a master's degree in economics from the London School of Economics. He has authored many reports and policy briefs, some of which include the National Oil Companies and Climate Change Insights for Advocates, Stuck in the Past, Lessons on Emissions for Developing Oil Producers, and his latest report, No Time to Waste, Governing Cobalt Amid the Energy Transition, which focuses on cobalt as a critical mineral in energy transition with the case study of the DRC. So welcome, David, and please carry on, share your presentation with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar. Thank you, Pavin. It's really nice to be here today. I'll get going, really. I'll probably talk about for 30 minutes, and then I really hope we can have a good discussion. And I was I was listening in a bit yesterday, and I really like the comments and the questions, so I'm looking forward to that. So I'll share my screen and get on with it. So I'm going to look at quite a specific thing here. It's the transition risk and response for oil and gas exporting countries. And I'll tell you what I mean about that soon. But before I do, I've often stood up in these sort of fora before, and no matter what I've said, people have seen me as someone coming from London, a white guy, and there's a lot of cognitive biases going on about what I'm trying to say. So I want to be quite clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. And an NRGI's position is this: to meet the Paris target, the climate target, there cannot be any new oil and gas developments. Okay, so that's from the IEA report a couple of years ago, and I'm sure quite a lot of you know that it made the news. Now, some might say that that means, yes, we should shut down all new oil projects. We can't go any further. But NRGI's position takes it a step further and says, however, high polluting rich countries should shut down first. Okay, we can put a bit more meat to this. And this comes from a Tyndall report, this report that just came out, I think, last month. So the Tyndall report looks at what would be the fairest way of projects and countries to shut down the oil and gas production. And it looked at proposed production end dates. It looked at how much would be reduced by 2030. And then the global share in each of these groups. And then what I've done, they list all the countries. What I've done here is just list the ones, some of them are ones in Africa. And according to the Tyndall report, which looks like what's the fairest way of shutting down production, they put almost all African countries way towards the end in 2045 or 2050. Okay, so there is at least a dilemma, and as Pavin was saying, there's probably a trilemma, that we have to save the world's climate, which is the fault of rich people in general, wherever they are in the world, because as a recent report showed, it is the rich that pollute the most now and historically. And the average African is not rich. The average African consumes less electricity than a fridge freezer in America. Okay, so one fridge freezer consumes more electricity than the average African. So it's unfair to think that oil and gas projects in poor countries in Africa should be shutting down at the same time as everyone else. But the dilemma is all this has to go at some point. So that's one element of climate justice. But I'm not going to talk about climate justice because this is normative. This is what we would like to happen, but it's unlikely to happen. There's no international mechanism. There's no initiative that is in process that is leading to this right now. It's a goal, it's a hope, but it's not happening. So I'm going to talk about the more basic economics of what probably will happen. And it's really based around a concept called the cost curve. And I'm going to get to that soon. So just to broaden what I'm going to say and what I'm not going to say. The scope, I'm not going to talk about production shutdown. So I'm not going to talk about that any country should be shutting down production. And I'm also not actually going to be talking much about coal. And NRGI doesn't really work on coal because it doesn't produce an oil curse, a resource curse like oil and gas. But quite a few of the issues that I'm going to talk about are relevant. I'm also not going to talk about critical minerals or green metals. I have just released a report on that, and NRGI does a lot of work on that. And maybe one day we can speak about that, but I'm leaving that aside. And that's definitely a big opportunity for a lot of countries in Africa. I'm also not talking about the domestic energy transition or Africa's own emissions, okay? Again, lots of opportunities here, but it's a whole nother subject. What I am talking about is transition risk for exporters. What do I mean by that? It's this. I'll let you read it. Okay, so in simpler terms, as global economies, the US, Europe, China, Japan, and so on, go down this road of the energy transition, as they use less oil and gas, they are likely to reduce their demand for oil and gas exports from the countries you represent. Now, it's a potential, it's a risk, it's an uncertainty, because we don't know how fast this is going to happen. I'm going to talk about that uncertainty soon. But if it's realized, it's going to lead to falling government revenues. We've just heard that oil and gas countries often rely a lot on government revenues from oil and gas projects. Poor returns on capital invested in NOCs. Okay, so NOCs don't often actually produce much returns anyway, but in this climate, they can produce a lot less. Unemployment. There's not actually lots of people employed in the oil and gas industry, but they are highly paid, and this could lead to unemployment. And then stranded gas for domestic uses. So countries that were hoping to have gas projects invested and developed in, and then use a portion or all of that gas for the domestic economy, they may not have that realized, and that gas may be stranded. They may have to find another way of getting energy. So I'm going to unpack this a little. I'm going to talk about transition uncertainty, then transition impact, and then going to talk a little about policy responses and what civil society organizations like you guys can do. So the big thing here is uncertainty. There's a goal of meeting the Paris Agreement by 2050, but it's unlikely to actually happen. And we don't actually know how fast the transition is going to happen. And there's various sources of uncertainty here. How fast will electric vehicles spread? Where I am in London, a good number of the vehicles are now hybrid electric or fully electric. But that's not the case in the rest of Britain, and that's definitely not the case in the rest of the world, but they are growing in number. How fast will the transition happening for what's called the hard to decarbonize sectors like planes and trucks and so on? Can there be mass commercial viability of carbon capture and storage? And this is the hope of the oil and gas industry. So far, there's very few actual projects, about 28 projects in total in the whole world that's employing this technology. It's very, very few, but it's a hope of the industry to use it. How quickly will countries switch away from coal? And in doing so, will they move to gas, or will they leapfrog all the way to variable renewable energy like solar and wind? And what are going to be the actions of oil producers, both the international oil companies like Exxon and BP, and the petro-state governments, the OPECs, the Saudi Arabias, and Nigerias, and so on? Will they pump as much oil as possible to take advantage of the high prices now, or are they going to play a much longer game? And there's lots of research on kind of game theory around what might happen there. How important are petrochemicals? So some of the value of crude oil and more of the value of gas doesn't go into transport or power or heating, it goes into making petrochemicals. So those are various sorts of uncertainties. It's various aspects of the energy transition. And each of those, there's a whole, we could talk a lot about each one of those and where it will be. And no one really knows, so that's the uncertainty. But the main one here is looking at electric vehicles, because almost half of oil goes to powering road vehicles, cars and trucks. The rest, all of those other uses, including the non-energy uses, so that's petrochemicals mainly, is the other half of the oil consumption. So all this means, how fast will long-term global demand fall? Okay, both in oil and gas. And there's a separate issue about both those because oil has its own market and gas has different uses. Now, the other aspect of uncertainty is there is not one transition. There are hundreds of transitions, each transitioning happening in each country and in actually each region in every country. And this graph shows, I guess, the speed of each of the transitions in each of these countries in a kind of scoring mechanism. So those dark blues countries are moving the fastest, and it's mainly the Northern European and Nordic countries. And that's really powered for two reasons. One, the politics of Europe has always been or has become more concerned about environmentalism, but it's also very much to do with energy security. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine is making energy security a much more prominent factor, and is likely, and is I see already, leading to even more acceleration of the energy transition in that region. Other regions of the world are going slightly slower. And this is not a black mark on those countries in black and grey. As we said, there's good reasons why they're not transitioning, nor is there any need for a lot of these countries to transition fast. But this is another part of the uncertainty. There's lots of different transitions going on, and within that, lots of different sectors that are transitioning different ways. And it all comes down to the big unknown for oil and gas exporters. What is the oil price? So that's always been volatile. It's always been uncertain. This is the history of oil prices from the Second World War onwards. And when OPEC started, you can see very much higher volatility. And it's what happens next. We can think about this in lots of different ways. These are going to be some different scenarios, which are basically stories of the future, different ways of imagining what might happen. The IEA came out with this net zero scenario, which, let's say, is the very fast transition that much of the global economy transitions very quickly and meets the Paris target. Then they reckon that the eventual oil price by 2050 will be somewhere around $25 a barrel. The average historically has been about $60 a barrel. This is in real terms. Okay, so taking away the effect of inflation. But that would be quite a slow transition. It's going to be somewhere probably between $60 and $25 a barrel, but let's not get too caught up in the numbers. The EIA, which is an American agency on energy, believes that it looks at one of its scenarios and thinks actually prices could be much higher in the future. So for environmental reasons, we hope it's that fast transition, but we shouldn't base things on hope. We need to think about all these scenarios. The IOCs, the international oil companies, for their part, at least before the Russian invasion, thought that their average long-term forecast was $62 a barrel, which is basically what it has been in the past. But they test their projects at $30 and $40 a barrel. Okay, so they hope that the price will be 60, 62, but just to make sure, they're testing all their investments on a much lower price. And that's one key thing to press your governments on, is when they're making investment decisions on pipelines and NOCs, are they testing their investments on low prices? Are they thinking about the future in terms of these scenarios? Now, those lines are averages. In reality, what will happen will be some squiggly line like this. Prices have always been volatile. There's no reason to suspect they won't continue being volatile in the future. I can explain why in questions, but the fundamental dynamics of both the oil industry and actually all extractives is for this boom and bust dynamic. And so it's still likely there'll be a lot of volatility. So it'll be difficult to see what the average is, but it could be declining over time. Like there'll be volatility slowly going down, or it could be just be carrying on with an average of 60 or so on. Another thing to realize is that those scenarios, the slow transition or even the slower transition, $60 a barrel or more, are not compatible with meeting the Paris Agreement. Okay, so I want to show you this because there's a dilemma going on. We're stuck between a rock and a hot place. If we get a fast transition, then there'll be low oil and gas prices, which is bad for oil and gas exporters. But we hopefully keep warming below 2 degrees. I think we're about 1.2, and already Pavan was already saying there's really bad consequences at 1.2. So there will be changing climates, and that's still not going to be great, particularly for a lot of countries around the tropics. But it could be much worse because with a fast transition, with a slow transition, there'll be high oil and gas prices, $60 a barrel or more. That's great for exporters, but much higher warming and catastrophic climate change. And so we're really stuck for oil and gas exporters. They're stuck between a rock of low oil prices or hot place of having to deal in the rest of the environment with a changing climate around them, disastrous agricultural yields, migrational problems, wars, and so on. So this is all uncertainty. The thing is, it's difficult to think about uncertainty. I can show these charts and we can go, oh yes, we can understand that. But when we're living in the moment, it is really difficult to think about how to deal with uncertainty. And this kind of sketches out how I think all of us, but human societies in general, react to uncertainty. And mostly we do it by neglecting uncertainty. We do not believe that there will be any uncertainty at all. We just ignore it, or ignore it for as long as possible. And that's what most of the countries did in terms of climate change risk, is that we just ignored it. And some companies in particular tried to actually obfuscate the whole idea of climate change. But hopefully, and I think this is the job of civil society organizations, is to, instead of getting governments to neglect their duties about uncertainty, is instead to acknowledge them and to think through the consequences and think about either shielding countries from this risk, being more resilient to this risk, reducing it, or even reshaping it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this. Companies are also facing this uncertainty. They also don't know what's going to go on. And in a way, they're betting on the peak oil demand. How many years is it going to take till peak oil demand? So here's a roulette table, and we could say that peak oil demand is somewhere between now, and some people do say peak oil is already happening or has happened, or it could be decades in the future. So a fast transition would be peak oil's happened already. Slow transition it would happen in 35, 36 years' time. The European IOCs, for their part, are making a bet that the transition would be quite fast. And BP, for example, along with Shell and a few others, are transitioning their own assets more and more into decarbonizing and into investing in renewable energy. They're still keeping quite a lot of oil and gas assets, but they're really betting on that those assets are going to fall in value quite quickly. The American IOCs are somewhere in the middle. They think there's a longer term future for oil and gas. And while they're investing in a bit of low carbon solutions, renewable energy and particularly carbon capture and storage, they're mainly investing still in oil and gas assets, or at least very low cost ones. So the ones that will deliver the most returns. International national oil companies, Petrobras and so on, think that the oil demand will be going on for quite a long time. There'll be a much slower transition, and this is one from Aramco, Saudi Aramco, and obviously Saudi Aramco are in a very good position because they have some of the lowest cost assets in the world, and so they can sit pretty here. And other NOCs, and in some ways ignoring the risk completely, or at least until recently. So this was from GNPC, and this was from 2017. So their attitude, I believe, is changing a little. But GNPC wants to be a standalone operator by 2019, so they haven't done that yet. And they're world-class operator by 2027. So they're thinking there's going to be enough oil and gas demand for them to carry on down this route of becoming an operator. Who's right? I don't know. That's not the point of this. This is a bet. We don't know where in a roulette that the ball lands, nor do we know when peak oil demand will be. So what's the impact of a transition? Now, this is the cost curve, and this is, I think, one of the key economic elements that I hope you can take away. I talked about justice at the beginning, about who should go first and who should go last. But actually, what will probably happen if there isn't an international agreement on who goes first and last will come down to the cost curve. And what I'd have liked to show you was an international cost curve of all the assets in the world. But what I'm doing here is just showing Mexico's cost curve. But if you'd like, I can probably send you cost curves for each of your own countries. And a cost curve does this. Each of these boxes represents an oil and gas asset. So this is one oil field off the coast of Mexico. And it's the largest in Mexico. And the length of that box shows the production, okay? So the x-axis there is the cumulative production of all those projects added together. And so put all those together, and that's the oil production in Mexico. Then along the y-axis there is the break-even price. Now, the break-even price is a bit of a complex topic, but basically you can think about it as the cost, okay? Or put it another way, it's the price that oil would have to be for this project to break even, for the project just to make a profit, okay? So we looked at this project here. It has a break-even price of about $25 a barrel. So if the oil price is above $25 a barrel, that project makes a profit. If it's below, it's making a loss. And if it's a new project, it just won't get developed. Oh, sorry. And here what I've done is color code projects that are operating, that are in development or have been discovered but yet to be developed. And here are different scenarios. So this is taken from my previous graph. So let's say that the fast transition price is $40 a barrel and the slow transition price is $60 a barrel. Then you can read off this chart to see which of the projects will not make a profit, which projects will actually shut down, and which will continue making a profit. So if it's $60 a barrel, those top projects there will shut down. That very high price one, Litoral de Tabasco, but all the others will be making profits. If it's a fast transition, many more projects would be shutting down. So when we're talking about stranded assets, that's really what we're talking about, is that the assets at the top of the cost curve, to the right of the cost curve, are shutting down. So this is not necessarily just, but it's what the economics dictate probably will happen, okay, because this is run generally on commercial terms. And the gap between the price and the actual cost mean this is how much revenue that the government can be taxing. Okay, so if prices are dropping, the revenue is also dropping. And that's a key transition impact. So I can come back to this, but I'll just go through then the impacts. So the most important one for countries that already got operating oil and gas projects is government revenue, that in a fast transition, this will fall. And this is by far the largest impact. Now, I know a lot of your countries are new producers and are not yet actually producing anything. So this is, in a way, not necessarily a big problem right now. The other one is foreign exchange, because most of this oil is being exported for dollars. And so if revenues are falling, so is the dollars that the country is earning. And so this reduces how much countries can be earning and therefore buying new stuff from abroad. The one I think is particularly important for new producers is this one, the returns on public investments in NOCs and infrastructure. Because it's often at this stage where investments being made in some way or another, either by retaining revenues or carried interest arrangements or so on. And if these NOCs or if the infrastructure is being invested in projects with a high cost, as in they're sitting on that right-hand side of the cost curve, in a fast transition, they won't be making money, okay? So that's a key one, I think, for new producers. Other risks are domestic oil and gas supply, that, again, those projects on the right, if they're being used to supply the domestic economy and they're shutting down, that means less domestic oil and gas for the home economy. There's some jobs would be lost. It's not huge, like even in Nigeria, I think the employment in the oil and gas sector, which is huge in some terms, is only 1.14% of total employment in Nigeria. But there is a longer tail of suppliers, and so this would be a major problem. And this is a particular issue with local content policies, because there's a bit of a dilemma here. Is it worth now promoting local content policies in the face of the transition? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's an interesting debate. And then if there's any local companies that have interests in companies, either suppliers or with oil and gas companies, then they're also losing returns. So I'm going to go to what I think is most important for Southern and East African countries, because I know it's mainly new producers, and this is on the profits lost, the lack of return in investing in NOCs. So whether governments invest directly in NOCs or invest directly in infrastructure like pipelines, or they allow the NOC to retain revenue, either way, it's effectively making a bet on the speed of the transition. It's effectively like that roulette table that the IOCs are playing. So if the government is investing in high cost assets, it's a bet that the transition will be slow, okay? And that might be okay, but it's very important to recognize that there is a bet, it is a gamble. And if you've ever been to the casino or you've ever gambled, you know that it's good not to gamble away all your savings, because your family is going to be very annoyed with you. You gamble as much as you can afford, okay? Elon Musk can play on a roulette table of a million a go. We can't do that. And in the same way, countries have to decide how much they can bet, how much they can gamble. And it's considered context of government's ability to really handle those losses. So what we did here was to look at the investments that national oil companies could be making over the next 10 years that would lose money under a fast transition scenario, okay? As in the break-even price would be more than $40 a barrel. And we set this against the annual government expenditure of each country. So Mozambique is making a very big gamble compared to how much it can afford. The Republic of Congo, also quite large amounts, in Nigeria, Algeria, and Angola, also large amounts. In terms of the small producers, Ghana is probably the largest here. But this is pre-Russian invasion and pre the end of the pandemic, or the lifting, at least, of some of the lockdown measures. So lots of things are changing, but it does show an overall picture of the risks that governments are making. Now, there's lots of non-financial benefits to NOCs. So this is not to say that NOCs shouldn't be around, but it should be a note that these gambles, these bets should be very carefully considered. And for more details, we wrote a report a year or two ago detailing a lot of this, and I'll put a link to this in the chat. It's called Risky Bet. So what's the response from governments and for civil societies? And this is, I'm coming to the end now. There's lots of different responses. In the African energy transition, they see that IOCs are often moving out of the high cost assets. And so what they want is to find new capital for African oil and gas projects. And so they recommend setting up energy banks to preserve the oil and gas sector. In Nigeria, they want to be promoting domestic and regional markets, again, kind of shielding themselves away from the international risks of the energy transition and thinking more regionally and regionally and domestically. Saudi Arabia, which has the very lowest cost assets in the world, so they're really onto the left of that cost curve. They don't mind. They're going to be producing almost till the end. At least their project will be making a profit. There's a lot of problems with how much revenue they'll get and how they'll be maintaining their society and their government. But they sit quite well in all this. But at the same time, they're also trying to diversify their economies in different ways, and, for example, try to look into getting more from tourism. Kenya is looking at boosting renewable energy. In fact, in Africa, I think one of the leading in their own domestic energy transitions. In Peru, they're gasifying the country. So they're actually going to use the gas that they have domestically and use that for their own energy and heating. In Mexico, they're facing quite a lot of problems. The government there at the moment is very much ignoring the risks of the energy transition and want to double down on keeping Pemex, their NOC, center of their economy. And they're both reducing taxes, but also giving a lot of bailouts to that NOC to keep it going. And in Denmark, they can, until at least the Russian invasion, afford to completely shut down as well. But they're both a very rich country, and their environmental politics is much easier for them to do so. So none of these are right or wrong, or well, some are more right than others, but there's lots of different ways that could respond. I'm one slide away from the end. What's the best policy response for government? In some way, is to carry on following good governance principles that NRGI and I'm sure lots of your organizations have promoted for years. Is to tax effectively. So, as I said at the beginning, I'm not advocating from a purely economic point of view that countries shut down their oil and gas projects. It doesn't make sense environmentally for the global environment. From a purely economic view, there's no point shutting down oil and gas projects. Instead, it's better to tax them which we've always suggested is a good idea because that's the best benefit from oil and gas, and tax them effectively, because at least while there is revenue, you should get the most out of it. Okay. However, while I don't necessarily think that shutting down African projects is the right thing to do now, if there's public investment in oil and gas projects, that's a different matter. And as I've just showed you with that risky bet, it is a much greater gamble now putting public capital into these projects. And at the very least, it's important to prevent the wasteful practices in NOCs to make sure at least what public investment is going into this is worked as hard as possible. And as always, we know there'll be volatility in the future as in the past, and this messes up economies, and this still needs to be managed. And for the more developed oil and gas producers to diversify economies. For new producers, this is not obviously a problem, but for the Nigerias of the world, Angola and so on, it does matter. And obviously, none of this works unless there's transparent and accountable governments that actually implement this stuff. And again, this is still the bread and butter work of a lot of civil society organizations, and it's still very important. There's maybe a few others to think about. It's maybe good to reconsider investments in NOCs, whether actual investments or retention of revenues, and I can go into details of that in the chat. To reconsider some infrastructure investments if there's public capital in that. And what I haven't really talked about is, as carbon pricing becomes more of a real thing, it could be useful to reduce some of the emissions of oil and gas projects, for example, reducing methane leakages, so that the products that you're making become more competitive. But what can civil society organizations do first? I would say it's three things. One, ask the government, are they actually acknowledging the transition risk, or are they sticking their head in the sand and ignoring it? And most of us ignore it. Oh, sorry. Don't know what happened there. Let me yeah. So first question is the government acknowledging the transition risk? Second, has the government actually identified the specific impacts for the country? How much revenue could it be losing? What's investments from public investments? What are the returns could they be under different scenarios? How are they going to get gas supply? And then how is it acting to reduce its exposure? Not just in policy statements, not just in what it's saying, but what it's actually doing. What's its actual use of public money and the decisions taken? In other words, following the money and making sure this is actually happening. And there's further reading, the risky bet report. We did something on domestic supply obligations in Tanzania recently, contract terms under the energy transition, and a whole load of different blogs. And then also there's a whole load of stuff on critical minerals. And I'll give you some of the links to all that in the chat. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that presentation, David. And it's interesting, the things that you have raised in your presentation. What I have picked most is the question of the transition risk. You know, what do we talk about? Falling revenues, the poor return on investment for national oil companies, and unemployment. I think that's one of the things I've picked up. And, you know, unemployment speaks to the kind of policy tools we use in the extractive sector, because a lot of times people focus on local content. You're told that's the low-hanging fruit. Forget about everything else. You just focus on local content. So the question then becomes, is it tenable to still be able to focus on local content, knowing fully well that energy transition as it is may invalidate the need for local content, given that we're going to have a lot of unemployment? And then the question of stranded resources. Are we going to be stranded with all these resources, and what are we going to do about it? So I want to give Pavin a chance to maybe just respond a bit. Then we open up the floor for discussions. Put your questions in the Q&A box so that I can be able to easily follow them. And yeah, thank you, Pavin.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. That was quite an insightful reflection, David. And I think for me, sort of just following this is a couple of questions that we're putting forward. One, especially on the options you mentioned, in terms of what happens, now that there is a likelihood that the global market is not going to be able, or at least is moving in a different direction, and what the alternatives are for countries that, are still looking at this as a major domestic resource mobilization. What needs to happen continentally? Just as a reference, because this is a meeting that is based on Eastern Southern Africa, what needs to happen for that to be considered? The other part of it for me is, as we reflect on what makes oil and gas, in itself a big carbon emitter, and so my question to you, as we talk about the carbon capturing, what have you heard? What would you share with the team and say, this is what has been sort of analyzed, and that's what you can come back to the team and say, realistically, this is what is feasible or not?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, let me go to the chat and basically look at the other questions that have been posed. There's someone who thought about the question of, and I think maybe David can respond to it as we go. The question of local content. It's an interesting thing you raise on local content, because we've clearly seen that there's going to be unemployment if we go into a fast transition. So what will be the response from the African continent, especially in reality of the fact that we'll be having these resources and some of them are just getting into the pipeline in terms of being able to come online? So you can respond to that.
Sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
Sorry, the question of local content. And, most African countries usually look at local content as the low-hanging fruit in the extractive sector. So in the situation where in the scenario where we have a fast transition, what will be the fallback plan for these countries? Because local content will not be able to basically give them the benefits they're looking for in terms of these resources.
Okay. So I'll caveat this with, we haven't done specific research on local content in this situation. But first of all, we have to go back to, we can't pick the scenario, right? We don't know what's going to happen. So we have to test any policy under both scenarios. But my gut feeling is any local content policy that prevents quick taxation and benefits from production now is probably going to hurt the economy. So if there's local content policies that delay production for a long time, then that country may never actually see that project being developed. So that means that taxes aren't collected and actually any local content benefits aren't collected. So it means that local content policies that promote very quick improvements and use the existing capabilities of the country already are probably the ones to aim for, rather than much longer term aspirations. Now, saying all that, the things we're learning now is that, particularly for a lot of the countries that you guys represent, the best, where companies can be most competitive is in quite small, very specialized areas that are very specific to the region or the country. And so it could be that there's certain things, particularly with as projects are winding down, that there are very specific things that companies could be very good at, even within a fast transition scenario. And this links to one of Pavin's questions over carbon capture and storage. There could well be quite a lot of opportunities there. So and to maybe answer that question, again, we haven't done the research, but for a carbon capture and storage in generally, while there's a lot of promotion from the industry on these technologies, there's been very little actual practical demonstration of it at commercial scale. The exception is the plugging of methane leaks, and methane being one of the most harmful of the greenhouse gases. And the IEA suggests that there's a lot of the leaks around the world can be plugged at zero or very little costs. And again, there could be companies in Africa that can be specialized in addressing some of those specific issues. Another one could be in, if there is actual carbon capture and storage, using old fields to store the carbon dioxide. Another possibility, and again, I'm kind of talking off the top of my head here rather than from research, is about thinking about green hydrogen and developing hydrogen. And again, there could be opportunities there. But I'm going to caveat all that with, we haven't really done the research on a lot of that, but that's at least what I'm hearing.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Veronica, who was asking, what are the opportunities for intra-African trade in these resources? Because if demand is shifting away from the developing countries because of the transition risk that you spoke about, we still have economies that can be able to consume some of these resources at regional level. And yesterday we had a very interesting discussion because we were looking at the infrastructure, general infrastructure trend. And it's looked like most countries are basically thinking about exporting most of these resources out of the continent. What about the question of, could we be able to look at the continent as the first line consumer of some of these products? Can you respond to that?
Yeah, so I saw that yesterday as well, and it repeats the African's history for the last 300 years, right? That most infrastructures is taking resources out of the continent. And partially the reason is the money used to pay for that infrastructure has to be paid for by international investors who want a high return. And they're selling their commodities in markets with high prices. So a lot of the gas from Eastern Europe will be going to places like Japan, where there's a much higher gas price than they can get in Tanzania or Mozambique. So that's a key thing to address, that while the amount, well, even in East Africa, the amount of gas that is available in reserves is much, much higher than the gas that could be consumed domestically or regionally. Even looking at some of the quite optimistic forecasts. But the price that gas would get domestically is much lower than the price that you'd be getting in Japan. So that's a key thing to think about. And then a key thing to think about, are you able to finance the infrastructure to distribute the gas regionally at much lower prices? Okay. And partly the answer, one of the reports on Tanzania that I just posted, we go a bit into some of those questions. So yeah, that might be good to look at.
Thank you for that. Now I have another question. You've spoken about the issue of the most important thing to do would be to basically tax effectively. Yeah. So what is the place of the current revenue models? If you look at most petroleum contracts, for example, they basically rely on production sharing contracts, which have long stabilization clauses that basically guarantee returns on the investor. Should we rethink, as part of the energy transition discussion, should we rethink the question of the revenue models that have been used for these contracts, and as a way to renegotiate, as a way to basically address energy transition needs in terms of financing? Should we talk about revisiting some of these models? What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, I'll post an article from my colleague, Nicola, who talks about some of the contract terms around this. It's called tying their hands. But there's one thing is that a lot of contracts have already been set for a lot of the projects that will continue over the next few decades. And they're the ones that are making the most money. So in a way, there is no decision unless you want to try to renegotiate those contracts. But at least in terms of production sharing arrangements, I don't think there needs to be a complete change in that, because it's not really about the larger structure of these tax regimes. It's the details that matter. So it's more important to think about, should countries raise their taxes, keep it steady, or reduce? And actually, what we're afraid of is that governments look for the wrong goal. What they look for will be trying to maintain oil production rather to maintain revenue generation. Because often these policies are led by the parts of the government whose goals is about the physical oil and gas production, because that's what their objectives have been set. But for the wider government and for the country in general, they have to care more than just oil production. They have to care about revenue. And so it's less about what sort of tax regimes to do, but more a case of holding steady with keeping taxes at a reasonable high level, not to reduce taxes so much that there's a race to the bottom.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to invite people to ask questions. If you have a question and you want to speak, maybe ask a question, or if you have a comment, raise your hand. I can be able to pick up from there. Are there any questions from the floor? Everyone seems to be in agreement with what is being said. Eh? Are there any questions?
Edgar, did you read Peter Kafumu's question in the Q&A as people are raising their hands?
Yes. So Peter Kafumu is asking a question. Even as we transit, the Earth can one day cool or heat up, irrespective of whether we transit or not, because of natural causes which are real. We need, as we transit, to invest in technologies that could save the Earth from burning away during hot climate or freeze away during a glacial period. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's not our area, but everything we've been saying is about how to get the money to make these investments, right? That Africa, as Pavel was saying, stuck in a dilemma that there's possibly losing money from one of the largest money generators, the oil and gas industry, but needs to deal with the changing climate, and that is both going to wreck a lot of different, could destabilize a lot of different sectors of the economy, agriculture in particular, and just general life on Earth. But there's going to be a lot of adaptation, infrastructure and other costs to deal with. And so, yeah, I can't say what or how those programs should be developed, but there will need to be a lot of money for that. And while the rich world has promised $100 billion, I think, a year for some of that, it's not coming. Maybe it will eventually, but as a backup, it's really important to make sure we're getting as much money as possible from the oil and gas industry while it's still there. And this goes back to the risky bets of NOCs, right? But because there's a huge opportunity cost between taking public capital that could have been going into adaptation, but instead is being gambled in the oil industry. Mm-hmm. And it's not, again, I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but it's a gamble. And it's like if we're gambling away on the horses or whatever, when it could have been going to pay for our family's food.
Now, there's a question from David. I'm coming. Let me just ask the questions. Maybe if you can note them down, then we'll be able to address them instead of having one question at a time. So David is asking, David, what would you say to a villager in rural Eastern Kenya when asked what is better to explore the large coal deposits they have or not? Will it be better to explore those large coal deposits or not? Then Michael Adani is asking, how do we position African countries to benefit from the energy transition? not as exporters of critical minerals, but manufacturers of batteries and other renewables. Then I now invite Gerald Biarugaba to raise the question that he has. Gerald?
Yes. Thank you so much, David. Very, very insightful comments there. Sorry, presentation, and you, Pavin, for the remarks as well. David, as an economist that you are, looking at this from a macro perspective, on one hand, countries have to phase out fossil fuels. So the revenue that they were expecting to get from exporting, say, crude oil goes down, cannot be realized. On the other hand, they have to get the revenues very quickly to invest at scale in renewable solutions domestically. How do you avoid causing very significant undesirable economic consequences for especially poor countries who are already faced with huge public debt and where especially the impact of the COVID-19 has meant that there's very little money to spend on delivery of social goods and services. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Good questions. I'll start with the coal one then. So, of a citizen of the world and someone who's concerned about climate, I would prefer that there's no extraction of coal. Okay, but from sorry, I've already forgotten the name of the village in Tanzania. But from your perspective, if you're going to find an investor who wants to exploit that resource and provide you with enough benefits, and you've already worried about the local environmental impact of that because there is a significant amount, then there's no reason not to go ahead. Okay. But the two caveats there is if there's any public capital gambled on that, and obviously the larger one about the wider environment. Okay. The second one, well, I'll go to the third and then come back to the battery metals. Again, it's coming back to this trilemma thing. This is Gerald's question. One thing I think I can at least speak to here is that it's not necessary that countries need to be shifting to renewable energy. The transition for the issue that a lot of your countries have to deal with is a falling opportunity to make money from oil and gas, and the need to find an opportunity to make money somewhere else. Okay, renewable energy doesn't make a lot of money. What it does is provide energy, and increasingly that energy looks to be very cheap compared to a lot of fossil fuels. And it's renewable, so you don't have to think about keep investing in gas infrastructure and exploring for new gas to keep that gas flowing. Once you've set up solar and wind, it'll run for a good 20, 30 years. And it's the cost of that installation is getting cheaper and cheaper. But the issue that has to be dealt with is that's not the exports generator. There needs to be other sectors that have to be thought about. And again, that's really outside the expertise of NRGI, but it comes down to a lot of thinking about developing an enabling environment for these industries to grow. Partly that is in providing cheap, stable energy. So investing in renewables, possibly with some gas, is a good idea. But it's not the only thing. You need transport infrastructure, you need good rule of law and order, you need accountable governments and effective governments and so on. And then on critical minerals, on the batteries, I can post another report that we've just brought out on cobalt, mainly focused on the DRC. And it only answers half the question. So the question was, can African countries go away from just extracting these metals to being part of battery value chains? And I mean, it's another whole topic really, but there are certainly opportunities within that value chain that a lot of countries can take. And again, it comes back to my local content answer before, is that I think it's important to see the very specific, quite context-specific elements of that value chain that can be exploited. Large parts of it will probably be the domain of some of the much larger companies, particularly in China, but there will be specific challenges that will arise close to mine sites, for example, or in transporting to various other parts of Africa, or in the types of batteries that Africa needs. So rather than batteries for Teslas, it's batteries for motorcycles, okay, or tuk-tuks or so on. So I think it's really good to think quite locally about local needs and then develop companies that focus on those needs.
Okay.
So think small rather than big, because thinking small is actually probably more profitable.
Okay, there's a question from Rita Maina. How feasible is green hydrogen as an option to clean energy? We currently don't have regulations, and also from a technical perspective, there are energy losses from a production stage to transportation. That's the question from the Q&A. Then I invite Veronica Fadzai to raise her question. Veronica?
Thanks, Edgar. Actually, that was going to be my question, that when we talk about gas, it's actually deemed a cleaner form of energy. And there's also been a role in terms of its complementarity towards renewable energy, towards the energy transition. And the question is, what opportunities are there in terms of getting gas as a green light towards the energy transition, and also the opportunity it can present, especially to our gas producing countries within the continent?
Okay, so two related questions. They're really good ones. On green hydrogen, we haven't done our own research, but I'll send a link from Carbon Brief, who, if you want to know about anything in the energy transition, Carbon Brief have been brilliant at producing these really clear, understandable briefs on this. And they have a long series on hydrogen. There's a lot of talk about green hydrogen. So green hydrogen is the development of hydrogen using renewable energy. Most hydrogen these days is made from coal and some of it from natural gas. That's called grey hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is where they capture the carbon from that process and put it underground. And that's not really happening at this stage. But green hydrogen is electrolysis of hydrogen using renewable energy. And there is, a lot of talk about it. Again, it's Australia is already doing it, I think has already exported its first shipment to Tokyo. South Africa is doing it, I think. And I think Chile is also doing it. So there are resource-rich countries that are starting to diversify in these different ways. The big issue, well, there's lots of big issues. One of them is that you need a lot of renewable energy to create a certain amount of hydrogen. So you need a lot of space. Africa has a lot of space. And so there is a comparative advantage for a lot of Africa to develop that. But there's also a need to then transport that hydrogen to markets, say, like in Japan or the EU or the UK. And so that stuff still needs to be thought about. It's not viable yet, but it could be. But I'd read stuff from Carbon Brief to understand more on that. On fossil gas, natural gas, so it's, in some ways it's cleaner, in some ways it's not. Actually, when you take into account the methane leaks, and fossil gas or natural gas is methane, and there's a lot of leaks through the process. When you take that into account, because it's such a very potent greenhouse gas, it's almost as dirty as oil and coal. So the main thing is to find out how to plug all those leaks. And so it goes back to some of those aspects of local content policy. Maybe there's some aspects there that could be looked into. What's gas's role in the energy transition? sometimes we talk about gas being a transition bridge from fossil fuels, coal to renewable energy. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. And I think most countries are already leapfrogging anyway. They're not setting up a massive gas infrastructure and then they're going to set up renewable energy. They're leapfrogging straight to renewable energy. But instead of a transition fuel bridge, what I think is most useful about gas is it's a store of energy. And this is mostly now, or increasingly, how the UK uses it, is that, okay, if any of you have been to Britain, most of the time the sun doesn't shine, and sometimes it does. There's no wind, and we're deriving much more of our power from solar or wind, and that's providing in the summer a lot of our power. Okay, but in some cases in the winter, we need the gas, and so we need the stores of the gas to plug those gaps. And so that's going to be the role of gas until there's other stores of energy, until we get large batteries or we get hydrogen en masse.
Okay. There's a question from Gad Bender. Gad Bender, you want to speak now? You had raised your hand. Please unmute his microphone.
Okay, I think hello. Thank you very much, David. My question is about the this scenario of course, you know that the energy transition is, in my opinion, is a point of political economy, especially which should be contextualized in a sense that, for instance, if you look at the potential for oil and gas producing countries like Uganda and a few others, who are now looking at opportunities that now this is their time now also to be big. But again, unfortunately, they are coming in at a point where actually we are now discussing the transiting from that to. So how do you restore confidence that ideally they are not going to lose a lot, but also you also continue to see that that the international oil companies and other investment players are also seeing it as an opportunity, because recently they just signed the financial investment decision, and that was, I think, was a suggestion that now we are ready to partake this investment. So how do you restore confidence and trust that you embracing the energy transition is not going to affect your economy, is not going to affect your prospects, but also wouldn't it also be sort of like a disservice and to some of these other...
We're about to finish. Keep the question short.
Yes. Isn't it also a disservice in a way that for these other countries that have been, enjoying a lot from the oil and gas, that are being a little bit selfish by promoting the new investment potentials that are associated with the energy, the new renewable energy, economies? Would I be wrong to say that I think there is a little bit some kind of unfairness in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you.
So that you said quite a lot there, but I'll try and unpack some of it. So I'm not here to restore confidence in the oil and gas industry. Okay, I'm here to set out the dimensions of the uncertainty, and for your governments to be aware of the gambles they are taking. So we need to be better gamblers. We need to be aware of the risk we're taking. And so for Uganda, it's not deriving much at the moment of its government revenue from oil and gas. So in some ways, it's not got a lot to lose, right? Except if public capital is being invested in these projects, because that public capital is being diverted from developing the next big export earner, developing the rest of the economy, and instead is going into gambling. And maybe that will be beneficial, but it might not be. And so I'd keep kind of repeating this point, and it's the point of the Risky Bet report, is that CSOs need to demand transparency around these deals to make sure our government's using public money in the best interests of the public. And so I'm not here to say, yeah, go ahead because it's all right, Uganda can make money, because there's other ways of making money and it needs to be thought out more carefully.
Okay, so let me pack the last, this is the final session, so maybe just listen to the three questions. Huh? Someone is asking, Edwin Warden, making decisions during a transition is tricky. Cogent transitional decisions will require credible and reliable data. So what would you consider as the key information needs for stakeholders who aim to have a transparency, to have transparency and accountability in transition? And what would you call a just transition? This is tied to a question that I have, maybe I want you to address, the question of common but differentiated responsibility. Africa has not been responsible for the carbon emissions that have been happening. So to impose a deadline of 2050, for example, knowing fully well that some projects take about 40 years in terms of for the project to complete, will indeed then, if you talk about a common but differentiated responsibility, will indeed want to stretch it a bit in terms of talking about just transition? That's just a question. Maybe you can respond.
Okay, yeah, good questions, and the second one's particularly difficult. The first one on what should be made transparent, well, I've just talked about the deals that governments are making through their NOCs or with infrastructure. Knowing what those deals are, so what public investment is going into oil and gas assets, I think is very key. And the whole financial business of NOCs, it should also be made as transparent as possible. And NOCs are becoming more transparent, but they could be a lot more transparent. The other thing I think would be really good to press for is those 3 points that I made at the end of my presentation is there a transition plan? Have governments actually woken up to the uncertainty of the transition? Are they acknowledging that there could be a risk to their oil and gas business? Have they acknowledged what the impacts could be? And have they stated, and are they following up with those policies to respond to that? Ghana, for example, has said that they've just formed a committee and they're talking to stakeholders about what their energy transition plan should be. And so they've already started. So it'll be good to look at what they're doing. But that'd be really key to me is to that information. On a just transition, I'm not well placed to talk about this. I'm not a lawyer, and I haven't really worked on transition. We are coming out with aspects of that. At least I can recognize that it is unjust what is going on. But personally, I don't think that the talk around just transition will save the issue here, because while it is unjust what is happening, and it would be fair if projects could carry on, that's not how the economics of this works. The economics is based around that cost curve. Okay, so what's important is to reduce costs, is to not invest in high cost projects, and to use and to tax as much as possible and use that revenue to find new ways of generating money. So that's key. So in a way, it's quite pessimistic, but I think a bit realistic as well. And that's not to say that you should go to COP27 and forget about just transition initiatives. Like, as an African voice, there could be a lot of power in that. But at the same time, I wouldn't put all your eggs in that basket. I think it's really important to actually have a plan and think about the consequences of falling prices.
Okay, fine. Thank you so much for that response. I think given how much we've been able to exploit this topic, I want to stop there because we only have about 4 minutes remaining. So thank you very much, David, for having graced the occasion and having discussed the issue in detail in terms of what is happening. You've chosen not to discuss the politics of it, which is understandable, and I think that's where most people would have come in. If you chose to discuss the politics of it, it would have been maybe a different scenario. So having said that, I want to thank all the panelists, David Manley, Pavin Ngala for having given the keynote address. And for participants, thank you very much for having attended this. This is just the second in a series of webinars that we'll be organizing on these issues. So look out through your email. Theo will be able to share in terms of what is next, in terms of the next kind of discussion we'll be having. And I think at some point we'll be having discussing the question of mining and metals. And this is where the politics across the continent comes in, because, we are the ones who hold the majority in terms of the green metals. And how can we be able to take advantage of that situation to be able to do that? So I want to invite Veronica to give the closing remarks, then we'll be able to proceed from there. Veronica?
Thank you so much, Edgar. Let me take this opportunity on behalf of the organizers of this webinar series, NRGI, Oxfam, Eco News Africa, Publish What You Pay, and Tax Justice Network Africa, to thank our esteemed presenters for this series. It has really been a very enlightening experience. The discussions from the chat box, I'm sure you can all allude that it has been very highly interactive. Also noting the importance of such a discussion that we are bringing on board. As Edgar alluded to, this is the first part of the series that we're going to be convening, and more are scheduled to follow. But off the record, the next series should be happening along the sidelines of the alternative mining endeavor, which is going to be a hybrid event of virtual and physical sessions. The virtual ones happening from the 5th to the 8th of May. And in one of the virtual sessions, we should be holding a session related to the future of resource extraction and energy transition in Africa. David did acknowledge the importance of maximizing on revenues from the oil, gas, and sector and the opportunities in the wake of the energy transition. And as such, we will also be bringing you such a discussion, which is going to be being led by some of our partners, that is TJN Africa, Publish What You Pay, as well as the Stop the Bleeding campaign. So we will be sharing with you more finer details with regards to the virtual webinar series that is going to be happening along the alternative mining endeavor. It is our desire that we shall be continuing with this series based on the positive response we've gotten from this first leg of the series. It is our desire that we should be getting more and diverse experts and producing more robust discussions to this very important issue of energy transition, as well as the extractive industries. They, as alluded to into the objectives of the meeting, it is our intention that we would want to foster knowledge and learning amongst civil society and various experts in terms of as we will be preparing for the COP 2027, which is our Africa COP. And as such, we believe that this series will really be of value add to the work that is being done on climate justice and towards coming up with an Africa position, which is in line with our current realities, global commitments towards decarbonization, and more so towards the economies of our countries and our people. So we thank you very much, our esteemed participants, and we also look forward to having more interactions as such of this nature in the next coming series. On this note, we would like to thank you and wish you a fruitful Friday, and this brings us to the end of our series. Thank you so much.